And hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for joining our office hours this month. I'm Mike Foster. I'm a cloud native advocate at StackRox, and I'll be moderating this chat for today. So today with me, I have John Forman. John is an associate director and global Anthos and Kubernetes overseer at Accenture. He's been working to secure Kubernetes for, I don't know how long, John, at this point. You're gonna have to tell me. But before we start, I want to go over some rules of engagement. The lines are muted, and the session is being recorded. The on-demand recording will be emailed to everybody post-event and also available on our website. We'll be answering live questions throughout the session, so make sure to ask your questions. There's a little Q&A module on the right-hand side of your screen. And obviously, we can't give away too much about the CKS, so keep them high level, anything Kubernetes-specific security, just throw some questions in, and we'll go through them as we can. If you have any trouble in the webinar console, just refresh your browser. You should come right back into the session. That's it. So again, today is all about the CKS. John has played an integral part in the CKS, its creation, so I'm really excited to talk with him today. John, thanks for joining. How are you doing?
Great to be here, Michael. Thank you.
Awesome. So let's get started by looking into your background a little bit. So, being sort of the lead for Anthos and Kubernetes at Accenture, how did your journey with Kubernetes and specifically at your role get started, and how you move into the security space?
Sure. About 7 to 8 years ago, roughly, I was asked by a few leaders at Accenture to start the container practice in North America. And at the time, Docker was emerging with Swarm, and it was getting a lot of traction out there in the world. And it seemed to be like a pretty cool technology. But I said, yeah, why not? I'll take a look at that. So I started to spin up that practice. I worked very closely with Docker at the time, building that within Accenture, scaling it, and helping Oscar Rinaldi scale that globally throughout Accenture over the last several years. And then over time, we saw Kubernetes starting to become the pinnacle, right, orchestrator, taking over as the operating system of really the internet, is what Kubernetes was becoming. And we saw less and less, of a need to stay with Swarm. And so we began to gravitate at the time to Kubernetes in the early alpha days, we're still called Borg, if you remember that terminology. Mm-hmm. So we played with Borg early on, got very familiar with it, fell in love with it day one, to be honest, and never looked back. During that journey, security has always been a part of my background prior to this as well. So I definitely brought that into this as well. So whatever I was doing, I always brought it in with the mindset of security has to be part of this. We can't just go crazy and implement all these containers without proper security. So there's always early on, I built many assets around that. Even in the beginning with Swarm, around how do we best secure this as we build it out. And over time, I was able to build many capabilities around security and many frameworks around this.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome. Yeah. So over that time, when you've started to develop these things, I'm assuming that's one of the reasons why the Linux Foundation and the CNCF reached out and sort of consulted with you and Accenture about how the CKS was going to take place and what components to kind of bring to the exam. Is there anything you can expand on in terms of that exam creation process and what it was like?
Yeah. So I guess about 2.5 years ago, I started thinking about this crazy idea of why not have a certification program for Kubernetes security? It doesn't exist. CKA is out there. Everybody's getting their administration certificates. You have Google Professional, all the certs out there, train traction. A lot of people getting certified in this, but when it comes to security, there was a gap. A lot of people just really didn't understand the reason for that or what they wanted to do. And time after time, I would go to clients and they had this rocket stack mentality of security, right? And with containers, it's a whole new world. The tools you have need to be container aware. And a lot of times when you go to the Fortune 500 companies, the tools they have are not container aware. They won't work in that area. So we started those conversations, and then I saw this large gap in the knowledge base in this area. And I started thinking about how could we formulate a plan to get around this. So I met Cheryl Hung, over coffee at KubeCon the year prior, and I started to explain this idea to her, and that's how it started. And then from that, we created a committee that was pretty much globally, we had experts globally contribute to the CKS exam over time, and it evolved. But my whole story, the reason why I did this in the beginning was to be a litmus test. I'm a very, if you ever work with me, I'm a hard ass. You'll know that from day one. I expect a lot from the people that work for me. And so to me, I had to create something that I would hire you. So if you pass this test, I would hire that person because they passed the test. So the litmus test to me is for anybody building a DevSecOps, team within their company, the CKS exam should be a pillar to say that, I want to hire people who pass this exam because coming in, I know they're going to know their stuff. I know it's going to be, a home run on day one. So for me, it was about that litmus test to build, right? So I selfishly did it for myself, believe it or not, in the beginning. But that was a big part of it, to have that sense that, if you pass the exam, it's a hard exam, and I made it hard on purpose, that you know your stuff, and then you're able to really come in and hit the ground running, within the environment.
Yeah, that's awesome. Speaking of CKA, because you kind of touched on it, and I get a lot of questions around, is the CKA and the CKS, are they valuable? How do you pair that with expertise and personal projects and things of that sort? Is there is there things that you can say differentiates the CKS and why the CKS is set up as a post-exam after getting the CKA? What was the thought and what are the differentiators between the two exams?
So I wanted CKS to be focused on security. And, if CKA was not a post, requirement, then we're going to have to incorporate a lot more into the test than the security. Okay, to make sure that you have this full, well-balanced understanding of Kubernetes world, right, and the way that it works and floats. So the way that we did this was, when we worked on this from the beginning, was to say that, if I pass the CKA exam, I know kubectl commands. I know more than two of them anyway, which is great, right? I can spin up, pods. I can take them down. I can administrate them, RBAC, all those things. But then when it comes to things like, securing on top of those different layers, to harden those containers, those kinds of things, I want to keep that separate conversation. And that's the reason why we had CKA as opposed to CKS. This way we could focus purely on security in that exam and expose you to these other common questions that we want to keep out of it. Mm-hmm. If that makes sense.
No, completely. We actually had one commenter. It wasn't a question, but said, well, now we know how to get into Accenture, pass the CKA, pass the CKS. So I thought that was funny. And hopefully that test is made hard enough as well. Now, in my personal experience taking them, I actually found the CKS more rigorous than the CKA. Was there a reason for expanding sort of it into, security being whole ecosystem? What was the conversation between, how do we integrate outside tools such as, KubeBench and things like Falco and stuff like that into the exam? Because there is a bunch of documentation and different, there's more documentation that's accessible in the CKS than the CKA, right? So just curious as to, what that process was, because sometimes security applications come and go. Is it more about enforcing, general concepts to the people who take the exam? It was a little winded, but.
That's a several question. I want to first back up for a second if I can. And so I don't know if you noticed or not, but we did a beta version of the exam. And when we did that, over 50% failed the exam. So that means the test is difficult and not easy to pass. Mm-hmm. So, of course, they came back to me and said, John, this test is too hard, man. You got to make it easier. I'm like, what? Nah. But I'm like, all right. So we actually went back into it. We weighed some things differently. We made some questions a little easier. This way, we can have a higher ratio, but we still kept it on the throttle to be difficult. And part of that is the ecosystem, which you just mentioned. So over the last 7 years, I've been working very closely with this ecosystem. I got to know a lot of great people, people from StackRox and so on, during my ecosystem, partnerships. And to me, the ecosystem is a glue of Kubernetes. Kubernetes is CNCF, it's open source. It's there along with, all the other fantastic tools like Prometheus and everything else out there. But around that is a vendor support ecosystem around that. And, to me, for you to be a well-rounded, Kubernetes engineer and security engineer within Kubernetes, you need to understand how those pieces work into the puzzle. How do you fit those into your solution. Because when you work for a client, whether you're a consultant like I am, or you work for a company directly, you need to understand what is the best tools for this environment to use. Is it JFrog Artifactory, for example, versus a different repository? Is it Nexus? Understanding that those tools is critical to success and implementation of this, right? And then it's about best of breed also. A big part of this exam was for me to focus on best of breed tools. So when you're going through the exam, a lot of the questions, a lot of the third-party tools we're interested in are best of breed solutions, right? So to me, it's about building that best of breed solution from your toolbox that you become an expert in, that you can go into any environment, right, and really understand the DevSecOps pipeline and be able to either modify it, build it, or support it.
Great. Yeah, I definitely agree with you on the hardness of the test. We have a couple questions I just want to get to. Waleed, he had a great question about what would be next for one's security journey after the CKS, right? So there is that core understanding and, like you said, tool implementation and things like that. Do you have any recommendations on after the CKS where you think somebody can go to grow more into the security space?
Well, what I will say is I work with a lot of people, many organizations, many companies, and a lot of people pass certification programs. Right? They get Kubernetes certified, they get, Google certified, Essential, Amazon Azure, whatever it may be, but they're really clueless when it comes to doing anything. They can pass a test. That's great. I'm glad you passed the test, but you actually need to know what you're doing. You need hands-on. So going back to the CKS again, for you to pass the test, you need practical experience. It's more than just reading a book. You cannot read a book and pass the CKS exam. That's on purpose. You have to have your hands in it and actually be part of this world in order to pass the test. At least that's my hope anyway. So actually, your question, I'm hoping that the person is already on the journey in the environment, already doing this, and it's implementing their knowledge with CKS. So to me, that's a big part of that. So to me, it's about passing the CKS program, and then, with your current environment, expanding your horizons, right, and understanding that environment better, and then improving that environment to be more secure. Okay. As far as what's next from that, honestly, to get more into machine learning and AI, what I see right now in the world of threat landscape in the world right now, it's about machine learning and artificial intelligence. And I speak to people about this, countlessly. And you can YouTube me and see my previous conversations I've had. I talk about this very often. What I see right now is that the bad actors, the hackers out there, are using machine learning and AI tools to attack Kubernetes clusters. So unless your tools are able to combat that and they're AI machine learning aware, you're going to lose the battle. So to me, the next part of this journey is really understanding what tools are out there that is machine learning and AI enabled, and really understanding those tools from the ground up. So you can implement them and understanding what those tools do, because they're complicated tools and not easy to implement. But understanding what they do and really having an expert level in that, I think will take this to the next level now, because I do think that is the next frontier as we go into 2021 and beyond, is the whole machine learning AI mentality is going to be next. Because if I'm a power grid, I'm running 1,000 Kubernetes nodes, if I have an AI attack in my grid, that's very bad. And unless I can prevent that from spreading, in an instant click, I'm going to lose the battle. A big part of it is runtime security. This is something, if you follow me on LinkedIn and other things, I talk about this very often. And that, to me, the biggest gap in any security environment is runtime. Everybody has a great supply chain pipeline DevSecOps, right? They scan the source code, they scan the containers, they store the images, they do all this amazing stuff to keep that container secure, and it's out there in the Wild West, right? And then it's exposed if you're not monitoring that runtime signature and those runtimes. So to me, it's about really understanding what's happening in the runtime after it's out there. That is where security becomes the pinnacle things. And that's where we need to start watching that closer now, because all the attacks you see in the news, all the attacks you see on TV is because people aren't monitoring the runtime environment. It's pretty simple, really, to do this, because if my signature changes, I'm being hacked. So the second my signature changes in my container, shut that container down, spin up a fresh copy. In multi-seconds, the customer doesn't even know what even happened, and you're no longer being attacked. So I think monitoring the runtime is critical.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Yeah. Just an FYI to everybody that's watching, keep dropping those questions in the chat. We're going to keep picking them off as we go. One of a pretty quick one is the CKS is only valid for 2 years. That is true. I believe the CKA is valid for 3 years as well as the CKAD. The why is the CKS valid for 2 years is an interesting question. Are the thoughts on the validation just that the exam is going to evolve? I was curious what the reasoning for the shortened life validity of the exam, John.
Yeah, honestly, that is a question for the CNCF, not for John Forman. But to me, it's about security is evolving very fast. AppSec world and all these things is constant. The tools are evolving. Kubernetes is evolving. For Christ's sakes, PSP is going to be removed, right? And so it's changing very rapidly. So I think having a lifespan within this exam is important, so we can refresh it every 2 years with the latest technology when it comes to Kubernetes. Because Kubernetes is still a young baby, right? Kubernetes is still learning, is still crawling, right? If you look at the history of Kubernetes, how long it's been around for a very short amount of time. So when I look at Kubernetes, it's very early in its infancy, and it's still growing up. And when it grows up to be an adult, it's going to be amazing, right? So during that pathway from immature to maturity, as it's going down there, many changes will happen, especially on security. So to me, it's what's important. We keep that refreshed every 2 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I did find it interesting that Kubernetes upgrades and updates were listed in the CKS specifically, and you look at the most used version, I believe it's still 1.15 right now, which is missing some of the newer functionality. So yeah, I'm a big proponent of, continuing to move with the community and using those new security functionalities that are built in now. Speaking of pod security policies, got a great question. The CKS talks about OPA as a way to establish policies in the cluster. We can't actually say during the exam, so I gotta somewhat ignore that, but are we going to use Rego policies? Why were other solutions like Kyverno ignored? And what do you think is sort of the gap that's in policy enforcement in Kubernetes?
Well, I don't think they were ignored, but there's only so many questions and tasks you can have, and only so many topics. How many questions are we going to ask about the same thing? We're going to ask one question about pod policies for different solutions, but that's kind of redundant, right? So we kind of picked, again, it's about going back to best of breed solution. OPA is best of breed solution, which is why it was chosen. Other things are out there, absolutely. You can use those as well. But why have redundancy when you need it in some cases? As far as further into your question, I think pod policies are critical. To me, when I talk to clients, that is the first line of defense when I talk to them about security when it comes to Kubernetes. Because not running this route is critical, right? And the other aspects that's exposed with CSI benchmarks is important, because if you go back to the benchmarks of CSI, that's all based on pod policies, right? That's why it's critical. And obviously now with PSP being removed, that landscape will change, but those switches still need to be there, right? With OPA and other solutions today. So we really need to understand that and really surround ourselves with that knowledge. Whether I'm working with Styra, for example, who founded OPA, or other companies with similar technologies like ACM with Anthos and other things, they're all going to be work very similar. In 2021, right, it's about its code. So when I build a pipeline, it's obviously my software is code, obviously, but infrastructure is code, right? Security is code, policy is code. Those are default standards today. Every pipeline you build in DevOps must include these. If you don't, you're living in the 90s, right? So we have to understand that security as code is part of today's environment, and that has to be part of OPA as well as we do these things. Because everything has to be scripted Terraform as I build stuff out when I build up my clusters. So everything we build at Accenture, every client we speak to from the ground up is built with Terraform and GitOps mentality. This is what we've got to be looking at as we build these things to the future. Because it's 2021, we got to wake up and start doing things the right way. So to me, everything has to be as code from day one.
Yes, almost. You hear the term declarative security, and I think people wonder what that means. And you're using basically declarative IAC, you're using declarative Kubernetes objects, all that work as documentation, right? That you can go and vet all your changes. So, moving on a little bit to image scanning, because there's a couple image scanning questions. We have a question of, should I use a runtime image scanner in production? Does it impact the performance in the cluster? And I'll add on to that question of, where do you think the best place for image scanning should be?
That's a little question. If I could answer the question many different ways, but from what I'm seeing out there in the world, obviously during my pipeline build, I want to do my initial scan, right? Obviously, number one, my repository, my container repository has to be maintained and scanned. So whether I scan that twice a day, or whatever it is, whatever containers, images I have in my image repository, I need to start scanning there first, right? During my build, whether I'm using Jenkins or Cloud Build or whatever I have in my DevOps pipeline to build with, as soon as that container is built, I'm also going to scan it for vulnerabilities, right? And now I'm living in development. And one thing that I really advocate, to death is is multiple environments, right? To have dev, QA, pre-prod production, limit for environments. I walk to many companies, Fortune 50 companies, who have two. What are you guys doing? No, that's bad. You want to have minimum of these 4 environments so you can smoke test them. So typically, Docker containers, I build once and I run many times, right? So the whole idea of this is that I create the container only one time, and now it's running the development, right? So now I just simply move that image, that running container to QA. I don't rebuild it. I kind of just move it to another environment. But during that process, I scan it again for a smoke test, right? And then from QA to pre-prod, when I move in that, I scan it again. And then from pre-prod to production, I scan it once more. So I scan my image several times during the pipeline. And that's critical because things can change during your different environments, right? We all remember, the inside hacker theory, right? Kevin McNick made it famous, right? Back in the 90s. And, there may be an insider, you don't know. So in development, they could be planning, somebody could put something, a bad code in there as well as in pre-prod. So it's important you smoke test every step of the way just to verify that you are good to go at the next level. And then once it's running in production, I want to monitor my tracker patterns more than the container itself. Obviously, runtime scanners, do they slow down? I haven't seen any performance issues with that at all when I'm looking at it. But to me, it's more about the traffic patterns. Like New Vector is a great solution, for example, when it comes to monitoring my different networking patterns that Kubernetes is running out there. Obviously, I got my service specialist with Istio and other solutions out there, Linkerd, whatever it may be, monitoring that product encryption and that ecosystem of that path. But, to me, it's about monitoring that path. So if I go to the pharmacy or if I go to work every single day, I go and I'm walking to work, I walk one path every day to work. If I go to the pharmacy one day, I'm going to be derouted. But that needs to be so that needs to be flagged to say, hey, there's something that's not normal with this current Kubernetes path. So we need to monitor that as well in production. So while I'm running when I'm monitoring my Kubernetes in production, I'm monitoring these patterns of the network. And if something is out there causing a bad actor, it's going to move my IP address. It's going to try to route me somewhere else. Once it's happening, I need to lock that down and spin up a fresh copy. So to me, it's about monitoring more about your network traffic and that Istio infrastructure as well, right? As well as the runtime, if that makes sense. And but as far as monitoring the runtime, it's we see very little performance degradation at all.
Great. Yeah, that's awesome. And you touched on a little bit of the next comment that came in, which was observability. So the question is directed at you, and it's how do you feel about the observability when it comes to troubleshooting policies? So, for example, why a pod didn't run, what level, what policy is affecting that pod. Do you think that troubleshooting process can be improved? That's a difficult question to answer. I mean, it depends on the environment. I mean, there's so many, dependencies and what-ups around that and how it was done and from day one. It goes back to, the fundamentals, right, in the beginning when it built out at a cluster. And so it's at McDonald's, right? And I say this so often I say this during meetings, but with McDonald's, it's the same hamburger whether I'm in New York or Seattle, right? It's cookie cutter. It's a hamburger. If everything is just code, okay, including my policies, right? So I create a cluster, right? It's hard and it works, and it's Terraform scripted, and its infrastructure is code, and its policy is code, security is code is in that. So every time I build a cluster, that problem will never happen. That troubleshooting will never happen. Okay, it won't exist. Why won't it exist? Because I'm running this proven cluster that's already
that's already coded. All I got to do is just run it, and I know it's going to work. There's going to be no troubleshooting about a pod issue because I know it's going to work. Right now, obviously, if I upgrade my Kubernetes to a new version, I need to retest all my scripts again just to make sure that nothing changed with my APIs. But if everything is just code, that problem will never happen.
Yes. Yeah. If you have your Kubernetes objects and it's a version control system, you change one thing, it should be a relatively easy process for debug, right? The more you're changing, obviously, the more different aspects you throw into that debugging process, right?
But again, it's like keeping this cookie cutter, right? So I create my policy one way that's governed with my guardrails, but with my governance around Kubernetes. So a big thing about this also is governance when it comes to Kubernetes. And this is something I preach to my clients, is that you need governance around this. It's a wild west out there when I go to customers. They're doing their own thing. There's 20 different pipelines. They're in the basement. They're on the rooftops. It's crazy, right? Stop, right? Let's have a model for governance of Kubernetes. I have one pipeline, so containers run anywhere, right? I have one pipeline that builds my container, and then once it's built, I can run it on-prem. I can run it in any cloud. I don't care where it goes, but I have one pipeline. That's secured, that's coded, that's good to go. And then this eliminates so many issues if you do that. Yeah.
Got another CKS question for you. Does the CKS curriculum also test the ability to perform security audits in Kubernetes? I know you can't probably touch on that specifically, but maybe touch on security audits in general and some of the other maybe audit functionality that's available.
It's not really, I don't think that was really a thought about when we were looking at this, to be honest. Security audit, those kinds of things, could be, a whole nest of a rat hole in itself, right? If you think about that. To me, if you have, your clusters validated, from the beginning with security, and that, it's being monitored, and a big part of it is your security team has to be part of it. As you shift left. So DevSecOps is a shifting left, right? It's the definition of DevSecOps. Everything shift left. Containers, security rather, is a first-class citizen, right? From day one, security is there. So my security team is part of this build out as we do this. They're part of the solution, so that when it comes to auditing, they already know what's going on. Right, so a lot of those things from the past don't need to exist in today. If you do the proper governance model, and if you do things, as code with the GitOps world, and you build those guardrails, things like audits of those things, is a thing of the past many times, right? And it's no longer really relevant. And it's about having that ability to have everything proven and tested and hardened, having my containers hardened with a minimum OS, right? And I can go on and on about that, and all my attack vectors and everything else in Kubernetes, but understanding that world and hardening that world and securing that world, and making a repeatable solution in a true DevSecOps fashion, right? Once I'm doing that, do I still need that security audit? Is that still, and if I do, it's going to be a very simple process, right?
Yeah. Speaking of hardening, do you recommend CIS benchmarks? How would you apply them? What's your thought in terms of implementation?
Yeah, so I'm very heavily relying on KubeBench from Aqua, which is a cool open source tool that I advocate to people. Lisa Rice, amazing resource in the world, right? But when you look at this, the solution, right? Monitoring those goes back again to the PSP. Once the PSP leaves, what happens with that also? So again, this may need to be revisited in 2 releases to see what this changes in that world right now today. But to me, it's about will that work with the U.S. government or a local client? The benchmarks is part of that process. Locking those down is critical, as well as AppBomb or SecComp are also critical to my success. I don't want to see a container running without them. Okay, if you're running that, don't call me. I don't want to hear it. You have to be doing those things if you're serious about security. Whether it's AppBomb or SecComp, with a combination of your POP policies, that's going to harden your container. It's pretty simple, really. That's what you got to do. There's no magic here, but you had to do that for it to work, right? And once you harden that container using a minimal OS, because I don't need an HP laser flow driver on microservice. I'm never going to use that driver. Why have it in my build? So have that minimum OS, a small footprint as much as possible when I build that container. Okay, is the first thing I wanted to do harden that container is to use that minimum operating OS, a kernel, right, from the container registry, and then BSecCop or EPM over that, and then build in my all of my switches, right, my CSI benchmarks into that. To me, I think it's critical to have those in place, because the last thing you want to do is be hacked because you're running as root. Something so simple. But having my benchmarks turned on will eliminate it that from day one, right?
Yeah, I think the CKS does a good job at trying to highlight the external tools, that it's not just security in Kubernetes, right? There is that whole infrastructure as code and node setup as well. So hardening the node OS is also a key component of the exam. From your observation, just a general question, what do you think are some of the most important security tools that you think enterprises are missing in their cloud native journey? What are the tools that you stumble upon, like the biggest gap that you're seeing when you talk to different enterprises?
I'll answer that in a second, but I just see a quick question about about the HIPAA and NIST compliance. Again, I think it goes back to Michael's question around CSI benchmarks. Within CSI benchmarks, right, HIPAA and NIST is part of that. As long as you are adhering to those benchmarks, you cover those, right? So that kind of answers that question, I think. Answer your question, Michael, more about, sorry, let's take a step back for a second. What gaps do we see out there, again, is runtime. So every year or so, my team and I, we have our Kubernetes security point of view deck. And right now, we're getting ready to update and release the newest version, where we look at all of the tools out there in the market, we compare them and the differences and where are the gaps. And where we see the gaps, most of the times, is runtime. We need runtime security. That, to me, is the biggest gap. And whether, this is always my answer, is runtime. The gap is runtime. We have to fill in that hole. That is the most important hole to fill in, and that's the biggest gap. Because if I'm using OpenShift or Rancher or Anthos or whatever I'm using, nobody does runtime security out of the box. You need to implement that. Okay? And if you don't, you're so exposed, it's crazy. So that's where StackRox comes into play. Because it's an amazing tool that gives you the runtime security that's lacking, right, out of the box. So to me, that's the biggest thing you want to build within your environment, and not to rely on out of the box. I mean, way back when Docker Enterprise, when it was a swarm, was the most secure solution out of the box. So if I was, if I did myself back 6 years ago, and I was using Docker Enterprise out of the box, I was secured. I mean, Swarm did part-to-part encryption out of the box, but Kubernetes is not, by the way. That's why you need Istio. But it has, it saw my images, it scanned them. Everything was in Docker Enterprise, right? So it was amazing. It was a great solution. But then, the ecosystem went off, and things happened, things changed with Kubernetes and everything else, and then those things became more exposed. Because when Docker did this in the beginning, they did it right. But let's be honest. And then things kind of went all over the place after that. So we need to go back to that time again to understand what was the success of Docker Enterprise, and make sure that we bring in those fundamentals into our world today. Right? We really need to make sure we're doing that, because right now that's lacking. And again, to me, it's about having the runtime security around those things is important.
Little bit of a shift in topics here, but I kind of want to. I think this is a great question. With serverless gaining, more attention, do you think that it's going to become more popular in the future? Where do you see the need for Kubernetes? Maybe where does serverless lack? Just kind of your thoughts around the serverless push.
I have fights with people all the time about this. Lambda is better than the containers, and what's this, that, and vice versa. I have fights with my engineers all the time about this. They're fun fights, but jokingly, it does happen, right? And these are things we think about. I mean, many people tell me, John, the containers are dead. You got to go serverless, and everything else. If I look at, for example, whether I'm using Cloud Run in Google Cloud, or I'm using, Lambda or other microservices are a part of the ecosystem, right? But if I'm running a application that's going to be not a microservice, but it's a long-running application, it's part of an SAP application, it's part of an ERP system, it's part of my banking system, right, the heart of that system, it can't be in a microservice. It has to be a long-running container, right? So I'm always going to have those long-running containers in my environment all the time. It's those instant microservices for those calls. So if I'm running a CRM system, and if I want to do a customer lookup, right, I can spin up a microservice. The microservice will find the customer, give it back to me, and go back to sleep again. That's a great function for serverless. But the actual system running that process needs to be a long-running container, right? So this is how I built my ecosystem, and this has to be understood. It's two different things. It's two different use cases. I mean, my entire world today cannot run on microservices. In the future, maybe it can, but not today. There needs to be a lot of change that needs to occur, A, and B, what do you think is behind those things? So Kubernetes runs Lambda, right? Kubernetes runs Cloud Run. Kubernetes is in the background. You just don't see it. It's abstracted. So even though I'm doing microservices, and I'm doing, serverless computing, Kubernetes is still there. It's just abstracted, right? So think about it logically.
Yeah, and I think I found the weird, we shifted to cloud, and then now you kind of see in the last year a little bit of hey, we didn't get everybody to cloud. There's still a bunch of people running on-prem. How do we use both? And you see these hybrid Kubernetes solutions cropping up, right? So I don't think it's as easy as like we could just go serverless. There's always databases. There's always compliance. There's always these checks. Now, serverless has like their points, especially for you want to get something up and running really quickly. But yeah, that whole ecosystem around Kubernetes, it's still going to be used underneath the hood. You're just not aware of it, right?
That's a big, and you bring a good point, is the common control plane today. It's a big conversation with clients. So the multi-cloud and multi-hybrid, right? I have on-premise and multi-clouds out there. How do I secure this, right? How do I manage all this stuff? And whether I'm using Anthos, or other solutions, what is the best way to do that? And this is my daily world that I live right now. Essentially, this is what I do every day. This is what we're shipping in the morning. This is where I love my job, talk about this stuff with clients. But how do I secure the multi-cloud journey, right, from on-premise with containers with the cloud? Because this is my environment today. It's no longer simple. It's no longer one environment, right? That could used to be in the olden days, right, when I had no gray hair. And how do we secure that? So to me, that is really the pinnacle of this CKS exam and everything else. It's about how do we now, why not in the new modern world we live in, with the literal shifts of the world and the refactoring and the reimagining of the world, we reimagine our applications in Kubernetes and everything else we're doing, how do we best understand these things and really showcase this with clients and the customers and really secure it in the real world? And to me, this is where this comes to play, and it comes to play with a single control plane, the single pane of glass that I have. That I mentioned before to you is that one pipeline. That's critical to do this. In order for me to have a true multi-cloud, multi-hybrid environment, I need that one common pipeline to run everything, right? So when I'm architecting this, I need to have that in mind as I build it out.
I thought it was great. The one question that I actually really have about these hybrid cloud solutions is, do you see data policies, especially when it comes to countries and how they use Kubernetes, to become an issue? So let's say you run everything through Anthos and you have a cluster, because I'm in Toronto, you have a cluster in Canada, you have a cluster in the US, and all of a sudden there's a data regulation that goes up. Do you see that as a concern when you're running hybrid clouds? And do you think you can actively manage situations like that with a hybrid cloud? Just wondering if there's a concern in when you're orchestrating these builds, especially when you're making them HA and doing it across the world.
I haven't seen many issues. I mean, I do know we partner with companies like Portworx and Pure Storage, for example, where I can have my data now everywhere and scale it across clouds. The cool thing with Anthos and Portworx, for example, is I can have a database running on-premise. I can have a database running in Amazon and Google and have all synced, right? It will all correspond my different environments. In the old days, I keep on, which is a year ago, right? It was only region to region. So if I was on Amazon or Google, I could replicate my data region to region with no problem. But we've seen clouds go down, right? We've seen Google go down. We've seen Amazon go down. We've seen Azure go down. They do go down. It's possible. So if I had to have 5 nines up in my environment, what do I do? So I need a solution similar to Portworx, that if I'm running on Google Cloud, if I'm running on Amazon, and if Amazon goes down, I point my browser to a different link on Google run the application instantly, and my data is there with no loss. Having that, and that could be at a global span between Germany and Long Island, New York, whatever it may be. But to me, that needs to be part of the infrastructure as we build out this multi-cloud world. Is that architecture needs to be baked in, and the data ops is part of that story. Also, you mentioned data before with these whole things. When we talk about DevSecOps and what's emerging today with the trends, data ops has to be part of that discussion. Because data, is the most important, one of the most important parts of the life cycle. Unless data ops is part of DevOps, right? You're gonna have a big bottleneck in your performance and how you mature out there in the world, right? So start looking at data ops as you mature your DevOps environments as well.
Yeah, you might see dev data sec ops.
There's always
tagline is here.
Today, yeah. I mean, and I tell everybody, DevOps is dead. It's DevSecOps, and but it's true. There's always going to be a new acronym, a new day of the week. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, shifting a little bit back to the CKS, and you mentioned this before, obviously with pod security policies being deprecated, there's a couple questions that are just revolved around, do we need to study for pod security policies? What do you think the best practice moving forward is to stay aware of also, alternatives to pod security policies?
Yeah, absolutely. If you go back to the test and the exam, there are things around that related to those topics. I'm not going to get into them in detail. I can't. I'll get in a lot of trouble if I do that. But understanding again the basics of ecosystem of security, right? The third-party tools out there is important as well during this exam. Understanding the simple things, like how do I secrets management? How do I use that in a simple term, right, to build my cluster? Being able to implement things like AppArmor or whatever it may be, those kinds of things I think are important to understand as well. Just understanding that ecosystem, I think is part of the stuff that's built it out. There's a lot of, and it's kind of funny, and I kind of crack up when I see it, but I'm also humbled by it, that there's many companies spinning up around CKS. There's many things spinning up around it. I'd have people creating these mock tests and these test exams and these these training things that the people are now taking to take this exam. It's very exciting to see this thing that I built has actually gone to where it is today. And speak with the CNCF, by the way, the CKS exam is the most popular exam to date, which
Wow.
to me is amazing, and it's surpassing Google certifications. It's outpassing many things right now to be the number one certification. So to me, this is very humbling. And I'm like, wow, this is freaking cool. I did this. This was over a cup of coffee. This all started, and this is my dig in the world. Not as big as Steve Jobs' thing, but it's still a thing, right? Out there, and it's pretty exciting. Yeah, and I'm very humbled by this. But again, to me, I was in the beginning. It was about how do I create a test that if people pass it, I know I can hire them, which is kind of where it all started from. So.
Yeah, well, I mean, after that endorsement, I definitely think people are going to be running to go get the CKS. I guess everybody's getting hired at Accenture soon. A couple more topics. Yeah, that's right. We have about 10 minutes left. These sessions are going to be recorded, and there are some resources as well, just in case people are wondering. Waleed was in here asking questions. He also has a really good resource and outline on GitHub for the CKS and CKA. Recommend you checking him out and going over to the Kubernetes Slack channel. He'll be in there as well. Just with 10 minutes left, finishing up what are some of the major container scanner tools that you're aware of? And from an open source standpoint, do you have any runtime security recommendations for tools?
Of course. And also, I see a question on my screen, which actually I think maybe is part of this. John, what are the Docker container registry? That's another threat, I think he says, area of threat where Artifactory Nexus lack functionality, which is part of the tool chain we talk about today. And that's true. I mean, so JFrog, Artifactory, Nexus, and even GitHub is now claiming that they do container registry, which is great. I mean, but you can't be creating everything, right? You can't own everything in the kitchen sink and say, mine. You can't be a master of everything. There's always going to be a cap. And what it comes down to with those things is really it's about the scanning mechanism and those things. I mean, I love JFrog. I partner with them very close, but X-Ray has gaps in it. It's not made for scanning containers. It's just not, right? So those were those gaps are that you see in those different things where if I'm using ACR, if I'm using a real container registry, GCR, whatever it may be, and I can scan that, I'm scanning actual containers and what those vulnerabilities are about. So I leave artifacts to artifacts. My front end, if I'm running an Angular development shop and I need my images, right, and my NPM files, those go to a factory. That goes to Nexus, right? I don't put my containers there. That's where my front end code goes, right? I keep my containers in a container registry. And over time, will this evolve? And does it really matter? No, but like I said before, it's about best of breed, best of practice, best solutions I want to have in my environment, right? So to me, it's about always going back with best of breed solutioning. As far as what do I recommend, those kinds of things, Falco, which is part of the CNCF, right, from Sysdig, is open source. It monitors my runtime. It does a lot of cool things, but it's not automated, okay? And which is not good. So I can use it if I want to just kind of tickle runtime security, and I want to play with it, and if I want to start bringing it into my environment without spending any money, I can use Falco. And that will give me the runtime security, but I can't automate it. I can maybe script it. I'm not going to tell you how to hack it. I'm not going to do that on the phone, but you could definitely do things upon the script to be automated, but out of the box, it's not going to be automated. That's where Sysdig Secure comes into play, and StackRox and Aqua, they come into play that does that automation along with Twistlock, from Prisma Cloud. Those are the best things out there, right? Those are the big ones to look at and understand what they do within the ecosystem, right? As part of that solution. And, yeah. And as far as monitoring is concerned, I'm a big fan of Prometheus and Grafana, right? I can't say enough about those tools. They're phenomenal. And so definitely, when I'm monitoring my containers, Prometheus, Grafana is always my first line of defense. They can bubble up to Dynatrace or whatever APM I have out there, that's great, and they're going to do that. But if I'm in Dynatrace or another APM and I'm monitoring things and it has the Kubernetes APIs, it is seeing it, but it's not going to see it from the bottom up. If I want to see that from the bottom up, I have to get into Prometheus to do that. So I recommend you have that out there as well in your ecosystem, for sure.
Yeah, no, you touched on a good point, because there's another question here about policy management that sits on top of container scanning. And is that the next layer of abstraction, right? And you mentioned, you have Falco, you have things like Trivy, which are specific for container image scanning, but really, the StackRox of the world, those are things that we tie in basically everything, and profiling and all that around Kubernetes context. So those open source tools are really useful. It's, it's a little bit of plug and play too, right? In terms of what you need.
Support, right? And having support is important. As much as I love open source, as much as I'm a big advocate for open source, somebody has to support the stuff, right? And I don't want to be called at 3 o'clock in the morning, personally, to fix something. So support is part of the ecosystem. So these vendors are critical for supporting these different things. And, to that point, as they're building these things out and having that, full rounded approach of full security and hitting every gap, understand what those are is important. And a lot of times the vendor supported products are the ones that are going to fill in those missing gaps. Although I'm going to have tools that are very similar overlaying each other. If I go true open source route, I'm going to have many applications that overlap and do similar things just to fill the one little gap. And to monitor that and to handle that and to run that and to support that is a real pain in the butt. Right? Versus getting a vendor support product that does everything, right, or close to everything with other things. So to me, it's about, again, I keep saying it again, I'm a broken record, but it keeps going back to your best of breed tools that you want to use.
Yeah, there's a couple people that are asking questions because obviously you do have a lot of recommendations around things like scanning, registries, managing the CI/CD process. Is there some sort of tool that you have published, or can people get in touch with you in a way that you don't give away too many of your recommendations? Like, can people contact you and sort of see, a matrix? Do you have any recommendations for readings to understand the ecosystem and what they can use?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm on LinkedIn, or you could definitely, or you can email me directly to my email address at Accenture. More than happy to take questions, after this discussion. Obviously, there is a level of, knowledge sharing that I love to give to people. But when it comes down to brass taxes, I've actually solution things. I'd love to get some time with you, sit down with you, and further discuss this, how we can work together to fix these things. I've been doing this stuff for a long time. This is what I do. I love it, and I'm a big geek when it comes to these things, and I just love talking about these things. And I have a very strong understanding of the ecosystem, along as what my team does. That I work with Accenture, that we built over time. That we have this true knowledge base of this ecosystem, how it works, and how is the best way to implement it. Again, if I look at all the attacks with Sonar and everything else that's happened in the recent past, we could have simply, not gotten there. If DevSecOps was properly implemented with the proper security measures, these things would never happen. We just need to think about things a little bit more as we do them. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And we'll be one step ahead of the competition, which is the hackers out there. Yeah.
Yeah. As an open source CNCF resource, they do have the CNCF roadmap. So just in terms of starting with Kubernetes, I think that's a great place. Obviously, as you start to understand the ecosystem, you will see some of the gaps. So that's where resources like John are really useful. Quick question I just want to bite off. The CKA is a certified Kubernetes administrator. It is the prerequisite before the CKS, as John touched on earlier. CKS is specifically security. CKA is more administrative, and it makes sense that those two are separate and reliant on each other. Quick one: have you done any DevSecOps style workflows in an HPC environment? It's actually a really interesting question. Not sure your thoughts.
Can you repeat that maybe a different way? I'm sorry, I didn't get that.
Sure. Have you done any DevSecOps style workflows for an HPC environment? I'm assuming they mean something like it's high performance computing, so something like research or something of that sort. Is my guess.
Right now we're looking at quantum quite a bit, quantum computing, which I think is pretty pretty fast in the type of ecosystem. So yeah, we begin to build those out now. Me personally, no, but people on my team have, yes. But that is definitely something that we see emerging quite a bit, yes, today. Especially when cars are getting smart now, and I know Microsoft and Apple and everyone right now is starting to build smart cars, right, with full, self-driving cars. So to me, those types of ecosystems are going to be emerging now very quickly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. From my own standpoint, what are your thoughts as to where Kubernetes can expand into edge computing and architectures of that nature? Yeah.
So IoT, edge, that's the discussion I have very often. And the cool thing that Rancher did with K3s, right, was something very insightful. And once K3s came out, I got really excited about K3s, because now I'm running a very small footprint of Kubernetes, right, containers, using K3s on the edge. How does that scale? How does that perform? How does that run? To a point, it works great, but then it does begin to fall off the edge. No pun intended on that. But that's what now we're looking at things like Anthos now on the edge, and other things that maybe more robust solutions as well. But we're seeing an uptick in this quite a bit, and these discussions about Kubernetes on the edge, it's emerging. I'm not going to lie, but we see it emerging very rapidly right now. Beyond that, my simple retail stores, right? I have my registers in my stores. If right now those are becoming more and more Kubernetes aware as well in this ecosystem on the edge of things. When it comes to smaller devices, if I look at, for example, firewalls that are now emerging is Kubernetes on the edge, which is really cool. If I can run a firewall in Kubernetes on the edge, think about what that can do to my things. And they're on the market since last year. They've been proving themselves very nicely. But definitely, if you're very interested in these things, start looking at firewalls and Kubernetes. I think that's something that's emerging pretty rapidly and very cool.
Mm-hmm. I got two more questions for you. What do you see as one of the issues, especially when learning Kubernetes? And I had this issue too originally starting, because when you use a cloud provider, some control plane components are sort of off limit for access, right? And then when you get into documentation about Kubernetes, it's set up for specific, let's say, file access or where configuration files are. Do you find that is a challenge in implementation, like in terms of a managed Kubernetes service versus the open source version?
So you're referring to upstream Kubernetes versus non-upstream Kubernetes, pretty much? Is what you're
Yeah,
going with that
pretty
question?
much. Just because like a lot of the CKS examples and documentation are focused around the upstream, right? And so you're trying to get into an environment to study and you go into GCP, well, then you don't have access to those nodes or, those capabilities on the control plane, right?
Obviously, CNCF is Kubernetes, it's open source, so that's what we're going to base the test on versus real world solutions out there. Obviously, as you use the Google console or other things out there, limitations are out there. But if what's up in the command line running kubectl, I pretty much can rock and roll a lot of times, right? I haven't seen any real limitations in that, to be honest. And if they have been, it's been very minor, just to be honest.
Yeah, and I really think obviously you work on the documentation upstream, so you know what's going on underneath the hood when you start to work with things like GKE or AKS or things like that, right?
Exactly.
The last question I have for you is around Kubernetes in general. What are you looking forward to seeing in the Kubernetes security ecosystem? Any hopes, things you're looking forward to? Maybe a replacement for PSP. What's your one thing that you would like to see?
Well, obviously Kubernetes is taking over the world. It's kind of obvious, so it's definitely getting bigger and better. What I would like to say within Kubernetes is when it comes to security in particular, is having that, even the runtime ability to monitor itself with the things. I mean, self-healing is a big part of Kubernetes, right? The way it auto scales and auto runs, those types of things. So the self-healing, I think, I want to see that mature a lot further than where it is today. I do think it's dumb sometimes, the way it auto scales and does things. It's a little clunky. I definitely want to see that improve because it just does weird things sometimes. So I want that to work better. When it comes to the posture of security with things, I definitely want this whole world of, the minimum OS war. What is the best kernel to use? And from that stance of things to really be fleshed out. Cry.io is a big thing right now. People are going, oh, it's the death of Docker. Okay, Docker's not going to die, right? But there's a whole big push to Cry.io and Containerd and what is the best flavor to use, and it's an abstraction to Kubernetes. To me, to be honest, what I want people to start understanding is Kubernetes and Docker is not the same thing. And there's great discussions where people kind of confuse the two together, right? That it's the same thing. Kubernetes is an orchestrator. It's all it is. Docker is a container that sits open orchestrator. Whether I'm using Containerd or Docker or Rocket, whatever it is. So I think that knowledge, that simple fundamentals needs to be known. So I would love Kubernetes to really help to educate a lot more in the world of what Kubernetes is versus a container. Because a lot of people confuse the two together and they make some serious decisions based on that are just not correct. So that's one thing let's see more, if that makes sense. And then the hardening of it, I think Kubernetes making the stance more on the container side, maybe understanding, maybe adapting more on the minimum OS level of things, maybe contribute to that as well to build those hardened containers. I think would be part of that as well and important to the ecosystem. I do think that's a big part of that too. And then having along with auto scaling, like I said before, and self-healing, also have that ability to maybe monitor its own runtime. And to say, if my signature changes, shut me down. There's no reason why Kubernetes can't sign itself. There's no reason. So if Kubernetes can sign itself, then monitor that. And that signature changes, just shut it down, man. Spit up a new one. Guess what? I'm not going to be hacked. It won't happen. So just that simple thing, which sounds simple on the surface. I'm not the one yelling at me to develop it, but I would love to do that.
Yes, I agree. I think it's really interesting. That wraps up our time. John, thank you so much for doing this. If people want to get in contact with you, do you have a preference? Slack, email, LinkedIn?
I'm a big advocate of Cal Newport. If you read Cal's work, of deep work and everything else, I don't do social media. I just don't do it. I focus on work. I get stuff done, but I do check LinkedIn at least once a day. So that's the best place. And then second to that will be email.
Perfect. From a CKS standpoint, there is the CNCF Slack, CKS, the Kubernetes CKS. I'm in there too. If you have more questions, feel free to ping me there. And we do have some resources for you. Again, this will be recorded if you missed anything. Thank you, everybody, for all the questions. And thanks again, John, for joining in. hope everybody has a safe rest of their week.
Thank you, guys. And by the way,
care.
if you take the CKS exam, let me know how you did. Let me know if it was hard or easy. I really want to know. All right,
Yeah,
guys, thank
we'd love
you.
to see those certificates. Take care.
Okay, bye.